Thank you for staying for one of the last sessions of a very busy and very packed forum. It's a pleasure to see so many faces awake after last night's walk and dinner. I'll give a super brief bird's eye view on some regulatory framework for transportation, because obviously we don't have time to do this in detail. And I will also talk about how technical standards can be used to kind of bridge some gaps. Because what we see for a regulatory framework for pipelines and ships and any other means of transportation for CO2, those are means of transportations that have been in existence for years for other types of transport. So there are already quite comprehensive frameworks in place. And to save some time today, I will focus just on pipelines and ship transportation, not talk about the other aspects of transport, because it's really not a time and place, and we can do that in more detail later. On an international level, we do have a lot of framework in place already, and the same applies for the EU. Fortunately for me, since I'm running out of time today, Daniel gave quite a comprehensive, a good presentation the other day of transportation regulation, or CCS transportation regulation, where he summed up that we, in the CCS directive and the ETS directive, do not have coverage for ship transportation, unfortunately, but he also said that that will come into place later on. They're working in the EU to put this in place and to amend the directives, which will of course then also bridge a gap in terms of financial incentives to do transportation by ship. Pipelines are already covered fairly well in the directives, and we also have the 10E regulations coming in and picking up both transportation with ship and pipelines. And we've already seen results of this with PCI and other types of project configurations. I am picking out a couple of topics, just mentioning it briefly. Daniel talked about third-party access as well, so I won't go into detail, but obviously per today, or the current status is that there is a requirement for third-party access for pipelines, but not for ship transportation. That will change as the ship transportation will be included in the directives. Basically means that we are trying to optimize infrastructure for CCS, reducing the cost, making sure that you can get access to transportation and for storage sites, which will be increasingly important as we get more sources and sinks around Europe. And it will also be very much an aspect of reducing the cost and making CCS a viable industry in the future. London Protocol, he touched on this as well. London Protocol has a lot of things. Amongst other things, we can find the foundation for the CCS directive in there, because there are quite a lot of guidance on how to store CO2. However, what we know the London Protocol for is the transportation prohibition. Cross-border transportation has been prohibited up until recently, or they changed it in 2009 or they amended the directive to, or the protocol to allow for cross-border transportation. However, it's still not enforced, as we know. We still don't have enough ratifications, but in 2019, the countries being members to the London Protocol agreed to implement a provisional application. So you can declare to IMO as a member state that you want to take that amendment into use, and then you enter into a bilateral agreement. And if you have not already ratified the amendment, you are also encouraged to do so. Summing up that you can transport cross-border to store CO2, which is a huge step for CCS, because it has been one of the barriers that have been pointed out for years. We know that already there are a couple of projects that are on the move, both involving Norway, one from Germany and one from the Netherlands. They were both announced last month. And they will, the interesting thing is that they will take into use different types of infrastructure. So while the Dutch-Norwegian project is looking into ship transportation, I believe, the main means of transportation for the German-Norwegian connection is a pipeline. Huge pipeline from Germany to Norway, picking up a huge quantity of the German emissions. hopefully, if that project is commissioned in, I think it was about 10 years from now, they are supposed to commission and start injecting. So interestingly enough, this underlines the point that we both have a lot of framework in place already for ship transportation and for pipelines, and that the transportation or the cross-border prohibition has been lifted for the countries who have taken that into use. I will talk a little bit about standards because since I've already kind of pointed out that the framework is kind of in place, we just have to use it for different technologies, or that we are transporting CO2 for storage instead of, for example, has been done for years, transporting CO2 for greenhouses and beverages is not other means. We know that we can transport CO2. But there are other things that we might need the standards for, bridging gaps that are not addressed in the framework. And I did talk about standards yesterday for those of you who were here, most of you I believe. So I will try not to reuse all the slides that I used yesterday so that you can get more information or kind of more variation in the slides that you are accessing later on. I will also just focus on one of the aspects on this slide because it's a busy slide, it's a lot of information, and it's probably a full presentation just doing this slide. However, I will focus on how you, for example, can use the standards to streamline the technical specifications in the project, making sure that, for example, in the hubs and cluster situation, that you have the same CO2 specification on the CO2 stream, so to avoid, for example, corrosion, or that you make sure that you are not jeopardizing the third-party access foundation, that you are not kind of pushing people out, and that you're operating on the same kind of economical and technical terms, and it's also reducing the costs in the overall value chain, and of course, also it makes it more accessible to the stakeholders involved. There are the ISO standardization group that I was mentioning yesterday in my presentation. They have two separate working groups that are directly relevant to CO2 transportation. One is the pipeline group, and the other one is a newly established group as of this year for ship transportation. The pipeline transportation group has published a standard already. It's 5 years old, so this year it's actually opened up for revisions to take into account all the experiences and all the observations made over the last 5 years to make sure that we have updated specifications on, for example, corrosion, on battery limits in the project. So where is the pipeline operator and responsibility stopping, and where is kind of the storage operator taking over? Although that is, of course, a subject to commercial agreements, this technical standard would help the parties agree to what part of the liability, for example, that the parties will take on. And as I mentioned, this will be highly relevant if you do third-party access, because if we are this is something that you all know much better than me, but if you're commingling streams with different kind of specifications, you will increase the chances of corrosion and increase the costs in the project. So this is absolutely a standard worth noting. And also worth noting is that some countries are already taking this into use, although standards are, as we know, private document, so it's volunteer to use it. However, some countries, and Norway, we've already seen this in the previous presentation, there is tradition for referring to standards in the regulation. And the Norwegian government, for example, has chosen to refer to this pipeline standard in the CO2 safety regulation. So it is actually already in use. The latest group is the ship transportation group. We have not started drafting a standard yet, but we are working on a technical report, which will, for now, sum up a lot of the experiences and knowledge that we have in the industry for ship transportation. It will also summarize some of the legal framework relevant to transport CO2 for CCS. And this will also, of course, during the course of the project, coordinate with the other working groups for the same purpose as the pipeline group, to make sure that nothing is missing in the value chain. Who is doing the intermediate storage, for example? Who is, how can we account for CO2 being lost along the way, and all of those kind of technical things on corrosion, as I already mentioned. So there will be a lot of information in this, both the technical report and hopefully setting a good baseline for a forthcoming standard. So this is basically my last slide, just summing up what I've already been talking about, that there is a framework in place, but there are some adjustments to be made, and we already know one of the biggest amendments being including ship transportation in ETS and CCS directive. That is a very positive development for CCS, and I'm personally looking forward to that being published later on. Up till now, we have actually still been able to use ship transportation in the value chain, but it has been subject to an individual application by member states. So Norway, for example, has applied and gotten approval of using CO2 or ship transportation for CO2 in the Longship project. But it's very hard to deal with it on a case-to-case basis when you can rather have the amendment that the EU is working on. So I think I'll leave it there because I know that we are already running over time. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions.